Cameras and other license plate readers can be found throughout the Mid-Ohio Valley. Our Haley Lanham sat down with the mayors of Vienna and Marietta to talk about them from the municipal side.
After talking with the police chiefs of Belpre and Parkersburg about the city's LPRs, or license plate readers, I spoke with the mayors of Vienna and Marietta to learn more on the municipal side. The city of Marietta has recently updated all of its traffic signals. They had the choice to integrate the flock system, but they chose not to.
We don't even have a preemptive system for public safety vehicles. So a couple of our intersections have cameras, but they're not used for surveillance or monitoring purposes. They're used for traffic control.
When you pull up to an intersection, you will notice cameras in the city, but they aren't flock or LPRs.
Some of the intersections you'll see like a fisheye camera, and that's for detection of vehicles. So that's what actually coordinates the traffic movements of the intersection. There are a couple intersections that we have that are that have cameras on them, but they're not monitored. They're not used for any kind of surveillance.
Mayor Slicker says he understands the concerns with flock cameras or those of a similar kind, but they do play an important role catching people who have committed a crime.
I'd be more worried about, what's being taken off my cell phone and other things than flock cameras.
There are policies and trainings in place to avoid the misuse of the cameras. In Belpre, they have multiple admins who can monitor the use of the cameras.
It allows me to make sure that it is only being used for specific law enforcement purposes, and we have multiple admins here at the department, so it's not tied to just me. Me and one of my sergeants are admins on that, and we can ensure that it is being used as a law enforcement tool and not being misused in a way that it would not be proper to use it.
The same thing goes for across the river in Parkersburg. They require officers to have a specific training, and they audit the usage of these cameras. Nothing can be searched from these cameras without a criminal investigatory reason.
But there's significant penalties if it's abused. Can be considered criminal in some capacities.
By misusing the system, it can cause the police department to lose the ability to run systems tied to wanted subjects, missing persons, running information themselves, etc.
Has to be done for a law enforcement intended purpose. So with anything that vital, we would require training and do require that training before someone can utilize the system themselves.
Up the road in Vienna, they do not own or operate any flock cameras, but according to the police chief and mayor, they do operate one Leonardo camera, along with their regular security cameras.
But none of those are tied to flock camera or flock camera systems.
Mayor Emmerich gives the advice to residents who have concerns to do their research and know the difference between specific cameras.
But know the difference between what a basic, say, license plate reader would be compared to an AI-driven system that is used to gather or to process additional information. The cameras and such that we have in the city of Vienna are simply for data collection in the way of surveillance, but not AI-driven in any capacity.
Reporting for the Mid-Ohio Valley, I'm Haley Lanham with WTAP News.